Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Future of BizTech. I'm your host, JC Granger. I have with me here Tobias Kunze, who is the co-founder, actually, and CEO of Glasnostic. Tobias, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what is it that your company does?
Absolutely. Happy to do thanks for having me on the show. So I'm a platform as a service guy. Previous company, I was a tech co-founder of a platform as a service product that was acquired by Red Hat, became OpenShift. So spend a lot of time thinking from a technical perspective and from a product perspective, obviously, how do you optimally support the building of applications, right? And then by running OpenShift or like watching how OpenShift ran or, publicly in the cloud, in the public cloud, also realizing that the building of the applications is not really the difficult piece anymore. Where the rubber really hits the road is like once the code is running, like how do you manage that? So the operational side, and more specifically, what's called the day two operations. So that's what we focus on here at Glasnostic, where we look at what happens after you deploy the code and before you deal with incidents, right? In that window of time, there's very little we can do, right? There's really, once something goes wrong, the only thing we can do is roll back, maybe reboot machines, that kind of stuff. And it's actually really surprising how much manual labor there is. And there's a lot of monitoring going on and a lot of like looking at data, deep data, root cause analysis, takes hours, days. And then there's the incident management piece of it, where you need to get all the teams together. You need to decide what are you going to do, right? Meanwhile, your customer experience is just nosediving. So we kind of automate a lot, big part of that. We say like, don't even go too deep on the monitoring side. Just look at how the systems behave, then manage it as it's happening. And then you can still decide how much of a manual process you want to attach to the backside of this. Meanwhile, the situation is under control. So our value prop is really, don't sweat the day two ops piece too much. You got runtime control now. We give our operations teams, the DevOps, the DevSecOps teams, runtime, real-time control over what's happening at a very high level.
Oh, that's great. So then tell the audience a little bit about what types of clients do you have? Are these enterprise Fortune 500s? Are these small business owners who are maybe developing apps or SaaSes of their own? Who's really your optimal client? Who do you really make an impact for? Who even is interested in what you have?
Yeah, so really important question, right? We thrive on complexity. Our product, our company is in the business of reducing operational complexity massively.
I like that one-liner.
So if you if you come along and you have one application, it's kind of like you build a single family house. You kind of built this like you always built this 100 years ago. It's a stick frame. It's something, you just put some things on it. That problem is solved. There's not a lot of complexity. There's scheduling complexity, but there's not a lot of building complexity. Where we come in is when you have something large industrial, you have a shop floor, you have an airport, you have these kind of things that are very complex, a lot of processes like stepping on each other's feet. And there you need the supervisory function that we essentially a management layer on those operations.
Got it.
Think of us, if you build something small, you're flying a single engine plane. If the weather's nice, you don't need air traffic control. If there's a small airport somewhere in Nevada and there's 10 planes a day, you just look out the window, right? And you land the plane. If you have hundreds of planes in the airspace, you need air traffic control because everything's unpredictable, right? You need to make sure the space itself remains stable. So that's what we bring to our
I like
team.
that analogy. Your air traffic control for complicated business setups and systems, so that's pretty cool. What's an example of like one of the clients that you have, or an example of a type of maybe a brand name that the audience would recognize? You're like, hey, here's an example of a client that could be ours, or one that you can say is yours.
Yeah, so clearly there's a lot of clients we can't name, but we play with Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, Global 2000, these kind of enterprises, right? Complex infrastructures, generations of systems, tons of integrations, right? If everything is siloed away, you have maybe 10,000 applications, but they're all kind of like running like a small Python app or it's a Java app on a platform, not really that interesting.
Are these like telecom or healthcare? Like what industries seem to be more complicated than others that you guys could help?
It's pretty horizontal, so we are not glued to one vertical or another. If I would call out a couple segments, I would say managed service providers are a big segment for us, simply because you're running other people's workloads, right? The code is not yours, so you need to protect yourself against whatever these applications are doing. And besides, how you run these is actually already pretty complicated, followed by financial services. But then a lot of automotive, retail, there needs to be a sizable amount of operations in order for us to be, really shine, to bring value at a good scale.
What about any like government or military applications with that? I mean, that there's so many moving parts in government agencies. Do you guys try to get any government contracts, or do you mostly stick to the private sector?
We have inbound interest from that, and that's kind of about what I can say.
Okay.
So
I reach you loud and clear.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So then, other than the inbound, you talk about inbound, so that kind of triggers me as a marketing guy, inbound, outbound marketing, whatnot. Other than things like this, like for example, being on my podcast, but what is your company doing marketing wise to get the word out about what you do? I mean, how do you guys reach out to other companies to just so they even know you exist, to provide this service?
Yeah, we're a small company. We're still at the beginning. We have our hands pretty full just by word of mouth from operations professionals. Frankly, we don't do a whole lot. I like to blog. So on our blog, there's a lot of deep articles on how do you, operate something that is essentially too big for any single person to comprehend. And those get good inbound interest. I like being on podcasts, these kind of things, but we don't really do a full-blown sales motion today, right? It's just there's so much coming word of mouth at the moment.
That's a great spot to be in. I mean, it sounds like you're trying to keep up with the work, so that's good. How do you prioritize new features and releases in your software? I'm sure there's a lot of ideas that you have. There's a lot of suggestions, I'm sure, that have come in. How do you guys prioritize what gets made next and released?
Yeah, that's a very important question because there's way more demand than what we can do at this point, right? Of course, we're growing. We're trying to hire pretty aggressively, but also it takes time to ramp up people to what are we doing? How does the code work? How does everything? It's technically very complicated, right? We are not a single technology company. We can inject ourselves in many different ways. So the prioritization, the backlog of features is something, it's a daily struggle. We try to unify as much as we can. Thankfully, because we're still early in our journey and a lot of our customers are still early in their journey, there's quite a bit of understanding and compassion from our customer side that not everything can be done this month. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
We keep them all well in the loop of what the plans are, right? For instance, huge push into machine learning. Obviously, we capture a lot of data. We want to make sure we don't have to browse them, manually. But we keep these customers close, and there's a little bit of a customer advisory board going on. But yeah.
So, personal question now. Side note here. I ask this sometimes to guests. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up, so to speak? And then was it this, or if not, how did it, where would that life path take you? I'm always curious, what people want to be and then how they got to where they're at, Yeah,
it's really funny because I wanted to be a musician.
Well, I see a big piano right behind you, so I feel like you did something there. I mean, it's a grand piano. For people who are only listening and can't see, he's got this marvelous grand piano in the background.
Yeah. So that's what I do today. That's kind of like when I have time. But yeah, I studied music. I studied composition and conducting. And from there, straight line into computer science, I started doing digital sound synthesis. That required a lot of programming. So that's how I got started in computers. And then between composing and programming, it's really kind of the same thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Very creative act, right? You need to think a lot. You need to, you can, come up with solutions. So from there, just did a little bit, a couple of industry stints and then startups ever since, more or less. Right.
Well, that's really cool. See, that's a nice smooth path, right?
To me, it's a straight line, absolutely straight line. Everybody thinks, what is this, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually pretty rare that you end up there so easily there. That's nice. So being, the title of the podcast, The Future of BizTech, let me ask you a question first about the industry that you're in, right? With cloud computing and there's AI and, and of course, like what you guys do, which as far as, taking complex systems and organizing them and whatnot virtually. Where do you see your industry, like you and the competitors around you, basically? Yeah. Where do you see the industry going in that next 5 to 10 years? Is there any, milestone moments that you think are coming down the line based on other technology that's out there that might integrate, just if you had to predict the future, magic 8-ball here, where do you see it?
Yeah, I think I have a pretty unique view, I think, of where it's heading, not in each component, but I think the conclusions. My experience is that, for instance, development is getting easier by the day. It's developing code, functionality. The functionality is becoming smaller and smaller. You're developing small, narrow, domain-bounded context services. It's a couple thousand lines of code, maybe it's a couple 10,000 lines of code. It's still not big. You're not building multi-million lines of code, right? But you're building many of these. So now we are in a world where we can actually develop very quickly, and the develop experience in most technology is extremely good. But now we're running way more pieces in way more places. It's not just on premises, it's not just cloud, it's hybrid, it's multi-cloud, it's edge locations, right? And what happens is not just more pieces and more places and more diverse technology stacks that kind of compose together, interplay. We also connect these systems more because we reuse exists. So part of the fallout from writing small services is that I'm going to combine these with existing capabilities that I have, right? Because
it becomes a Frankenstein model in a way.
Yeah. It's in any organization. How do you assemble teams? You pull a couple of good people from other teams and say, hey, we have a task force here. Please, can you do this? Right? Yeah. It's a new application. And that's kind of the model that's much more taking hold in the industry. Started a little bit with microservices, right? But even microservices, most engineers still think of microservices as a blueprinted, finished design application, kind of like your stick-built house, right? You have the floor plan and a couple of variations, but it's the same house. It doesn't really change. But we're getting, because the pressure from the business is so big, it's so large to accelerate, that now we are splitting up development in parallel teams that are all pretty autonomous. They can release on their own schedule. They can just push code into production. And now that code interplays with all the other code that's there, right? So you get into a very pretty massive multi-body physics problem. And there's two important aspects to it. Number one is, how does your transaction execute through all these systems? Right? Is there any bug? Is there anything that's taking too long? Is there anything on the path of execution that's not right or should be different? That's one big chunk of problems, but I think largely solved with existing tooling. There's a lot of observability, there's monitoring, there's all kinds of simulation toolings out there. And on the other side, you have these kind of environmental behaviors. Because something else gets deployed, all of a sudden this dependency is a little bit different, right? All of a sudden something happens, you don't know what hit you, and it's, some limit has been reached. There's a connection pool that ran out of space, right? A message queue that's full, right? Or something takes too long, so another automation hits in. So we live in an extremely automation-rich environment today, and none of these automations are designed to work together. There's a lot of impedance mismatch. Right. So that's where we come in. We are not looking at the execution of code actually at all, right? That's the pilot's problem. How do I land this plane? How do I get it to the direction or to the destination? We're looking at what is happening in the airspace. And no matter how well you plan and how much you automate here, unpredictability reigns. There's a lot of unknowns. And the key is to detect these quickly enough and react to them immediately. And reaction does not mean trying to hunt down a root cause. Mm-hmm. That takes hours and days sometimes, right? If there is a root cause at all. And it's not just a confluence of factors. But stabilize the situation, stop the bleeding first, right? Create predictability, and then maybe start an incident management process. Right. So that's kind of the story of what we do, but that's my prediction. Obviously, that's my prediction for the future of the industry. We're going to run more and more things in more places. And it's very clear there's a natural limit how much we can engineer here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And now let's talk about your company specifically then. What kind of new features or services do you have coming out soon that the audience could kind of look forward to when they finally hear the podcast?
There are quite a few directions we're going. We're going to take this, and one piece I mentioned earlier is a lot of like machine learning. We want to detect more patterns. Not every pattern becomes actionable, but we want to know and flag those patterns. Mm-hmm. The other direction is, of course, in increasing automation. And automation doesn't have to be necessarily a full-on closed-loop system where you just let the machine do whatever it thinks is right. It can be a time-delayed automation, so you can think about it, you can observe if you can do something. Often the human brain is much smarter than any machine, but particularly when it comes to operations, because you have more context. You know, oh, I know the team who wrote that service, so I don't think that's happening. They've been doing something else, right? The machine doesn't know that, but there's like automation pieces. We can make it much easier to manage these large exploding infrastructures.
Very cool. Last question I have for you is this. With all your experience and wisdom from before your company, doing your company, what's the best piece of advice either you've been given or that you can give from your own experience to the audience?
I feel it's been given to me. I don't know from where, but I think when I did composition, when I studied musical composition, one thing I learned is that we underestimate the amount of novelty we can create, and that creating something really changes the world. So I feel a lot of my peers are much closer trying to look at competition, look at what the market's doing, and try to be very, always keep the, enemies closer.
Yeah.
And I think that puts you in a very reactive mode and you lose the big picture. Mm-hmm. There is, by putting in the board game Go, you put a stone on the board. Mm-hmm. That stone has meaning, right? Whether you put it on as a reaction to something else or you just make a statement, I think we underestimate how much we can make statements. To make this a little bit more concrete, by releasing a product that maybe even just solves 50% of a customer's need, you're already putting a stake in the ground. You're creating reality, right? And that's something that I wish we would see more in the industry of.
I like that. That's really cool. And to further your point, when you're talking about like people react to competition, I always tell people, I say, I don't have a review mirror. I have no idea who my competition is because I don't care, to be honest. Because if I'm reacting to them, that means I'm a step behind them. I prefer that they react to me, right? Like we're trying to beat ourselves. Yeah. So, we're always trying to improve on our own processes, our own, sales or systems and, services and everything. And as long as we're doing that, we're looking forward and we're not looking backward. And a lot of the times too, if you look at competition, there's this tendency to think that, they're big and they're bad, so they must be doing it right. And they might not be. You might be reacting and trying to copy literally the wrong thing just because there's a perception that they're doing great, when in the reality, maybe they're falling apart completely on the back end, So no, I like that. I like that advice. That's good. So again, thank you for coming on the show. How can people reach the company, and how can they reach maybe you personally if they want to reach out for some sort of partnerships or anything like that?
Very simple. The company webpage is glasnostic.com. That's GLASNOSTIC. It's like glasnost and perestroika, right? It's transparency. And my email is tobias@glasnostic.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot. And I'm sure that me and you will be talking soon again as well. So thank you for coming on the show and for imparting a lot of your wisdom, and the best of luck to Glasnostic.
Thanks. It's a pleasure. Thank you.